All right, folks. So this video is nearly spontaneous, and it is in part maybe for me to get my mind off of a lot of what's been going on. This is just what I do. It's what I've done for so long, and it's pretty tough to not have my normal tools, which I don't have. They are all on my PC, which is currently still, to my knowledge, at the residence that I am not currently allowed at. So what I have is I have my phone and I have an app, a few other things. And for the last week, in the times that I get when I'm not actively working towards enhancing my employment situation and resolving my living situation, these are all things that are first and foremost at the absolute front of things that have to get done. But these little times of being able to study the Bible and maybe make a video, it helps a lot. So hopefully it's helpful to you too. I do want to say again, thank you to the people who have reached out since the last video to help. And please know that any and all help is absolutely appreciated. It's very much appreciated. I want to thank everyone who has done something, who is fixing to do something, whatever. And that comes in a lot of different forms. So to all of you who I've communicated with or not and have just sent me something to help or made try to help in any way, that from my heart it is all dear, valuable, and appreciated. So thank you. Now I wanted to make this, and I'm sorry about the audio. The audio is going to be bad as compared to usual because I have a pretty good microphone at my regular setup. This is not that. Okay. So what is this about? Well, over the last few days or so, I've been slowly reading through the book of Judges. Not simply to refresh myself with the stories, though there's a lot of great information in there that I think sometimes we might not pay as much attention to, like how the first couple of chapters not only are retracing what happened from the time that Israel came into Canaan and surrounding areas with Joshua, the procession of many of those events, and of course, what Israel did and did not do as far as what was deemed acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And you can read that in Judges 1 and 2, and you can read what Yahweh's response was to what Israel did or did not do in Judges 1 and 2. And Judges is a funny book too, because I think before I started understanding what a lot of the content and subject matter was, what it was really saying, even on the surface, before we get into problems with the language and terminology and what it may have said as compared to what it does say, just on the surface, the book of Judges alone is an enormously problematic book for, let's just say, your typical practicing Christian. And we could go as far as to say your typical Bible literate Christian. This book, and I say this because I remember many years ago reading the book of Judges, and these stories and what we're being told was really happening, and how that was all dealt with, and the fact that Yahweh raised up these Shephathim, or judges. Why? What were the incidents that happened? What was the cost of those incidents? What was the nature of those incidents? Those things don't fit a typical Christian worldview at all. I wouldn't even say very well. They don't really fit at all. So I remember many years ago reading through the book of Judges. Mostly what I would get from it is when we would get to the bigger stories that I had heard in more of a childish context, like Sunday school context, or, they don't really take you out of childish contexts after Sunday school for kids. You just go to Sunday school for young adults and then adults, and they tend to keep you in those same childish contexts. But that's what I would get out of it. Oh, God delivers Israel because Israel's repented of their wrongdoings. And of course, oftentimes a lot of language like sin and other things were inserted in there, which is such an abstract term, sin. But what would happen is I would end up being forced to see a book like the book of Judges through a Christian context and a Christian worldview, as opposed to simply seeing it based on what the text says and purely what the text says. So I always saw it in a very different light, and I think most people tend to see it in that light too, instead of paying attention to the details that I pointed out earlier. But this is not a video specifically about the book of Judges and those details per se. It just starts there. That's kind of our jumping off point. Excuse me. I am still actually, whatever the sickness I had for some time, it's still hanging on. It's better. It's better, but it's taking time and it's hanging on. So this actually has to do with the incident that we see in Judges chapter 4. We find out there was a prophetess. Her name was Deborah. We find out not only that this is a female prophet, but interestingly enough, and I've quoted this in my Facebook group, when they introduce Deborah, Judges 4:4, and Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. That's important. Not just Deborah, the prophetess, no, the wife of Lapidoth. And I'm going to go as far as saying she was probably a good, decent, obedient, moral wife, because I don't think she would have been a prophetess had she not been. So it's very important to note that the Bible does say she was a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. So there's an incident, of course. It starts out, Judges 4:1, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of Yahweh when Ehud was dead, which was a really interesting story with Ehud. That's what I spent a long time in before I forced myself to go past it and read some more. So it says, Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, that reigned in Hazor, the captain of whose host was Sisera, which dwelt in Harosheth of the Gentiles, or the Goyim. So what happens here is Deborah, this prophetess, knowing what's going on and knowing that Yahweh is going to provide a deliverer, a redeemer. It's usually the same language that's used when we see, verbs like salvation. The root is show, and that's what we typically see, is that Yahweh is going to provide this deliverer, this redeemer. So Deborah decides that she is going to call up this guy, Barak. and he comes to her. They meet. She says, I'm going to, you need to gather these men from these certain tribes, and you're going to go to war against Jabin's captain, Sisera. And everybody probably knows the story where he says, I'll go do this thing, only if you will come with me, and so on and so forth. And then she tells him, I'll come with you, sure, but just know if that's what you require, you're not going to get the acclaim or the honor of killing Sisera. That is going to go to a woman. And she doesn't mean herself. It turns out to be a woman named Jael. And this is where we're going with this. So there was a war, a battle between Barak and Sisera. And Sisera ends up having to flee. He's not doing well. He's being overcome, so he flees. And it says in Judges 4:11, now Heber the Kenite, which was of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had severed himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent unto the plain of Zenaim, which is by Kadesh. Now, I don't know if tent is very appropriate, or they lived there, I think would be probably far more appropriate than them arbitrarily applying things like pitching their tent. And I'm not 100% sure about this Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. That would give the father-in-law of Moses 3 names. For anybody somewhat familiar with Moses and his father-in-law, and that he met him basically in the land of Midian, and anyone who's familiar with Midianites, the study that I've done on that, knows that this would be an area of Midlands. When he's running from Mitzrayim, he's likely on his way to Cush, and these are these Midland areas. They're not necessarily part of any particular country proper. He meets the daughters of Jethro. His name is Jethro. Now, at a few other times, he's also referred to in the English Raguel, which I believe in the Obrey it's Uraol. Now, that might be more of a title. It does say that he is the ken, which is the same word used for the priest of the Levites in Israel. He is the ken of these Medine. Now, this Hobab is far more likely Moses's brother-in-law, because when Jethro brings Moses' wife Zipporah to him in Sinai, I believe Hobab was actually with him, and Hobab was the one that Moses asked to come with them to serve as a guide because he knew the territory so well. He said, come with us. He said, stay with us. He said, your people should stay with us, and you can act as a guide and a help to us as we move about. And he finally, I believe, talks him into it. But the point to this is that we see from the time of the Exodus forward this very close relationship between these Kenites, all kinds of Kenites. I mean, not particularly just the Kenites who are related to Moses through marriage, but many Kenites. Now, we know based on the language that when Israel exited Mitzrayim, that a lot of other people came with them that actually had been living in Mitzrayim, were probably in a very similar situation as them. Because not only do we see it back then, we see it to this day. Because look, whoever whoever the specific ethnicity of Israel is, there are other people that live near and around and among Israel. It happened back then in Mitzrayim, where Israel was staying in Mitzrayim, and you see, Pharaoh got so powerful when Joseph was there that he took control of a great amount of land, people, holdings. Who knows how far that spread out? And it affected everyone. It didn't just affect the ethnicity of Israel, who came there like 72 persons strong and grew to millions within, it was about 215 years. But a lot of people, just like we see today. Just like we see today. And I know that today, and especially in the last 50 years or so, that the establishment has gone to great lengths to really scrub from our minds this idea of ethnic identity based on geography. But not that long ago, this was very known. If you went maybe to a small town, it would be known that a certain ethnicity was the greater majority of the people of that place. If you went to a city, you would have neighborhoods that were, this neighborhood would be maybe called German, and that neighborhood may be called Polish, and that neighborhood may be Czech or Lithuanian. There may be a Jewish neighborhood. And then more and more there are, non-white neighborhoods. Like these days, Pilsen in Chicago is mostly a Latino neighborhood when it's said it used to be a German neighborhood. So these things, this was a normal thing. And these people lived around each other and among each other in our own day and also a very long time ago. Now, because Heber the Kenite and his wife Jael were living near to and around Israel, not in and among them, not particularly interbreeding with them, but with them, near them, probably having their own defined ethnic neighborhoods near them, among them, around them. I think that's the picture that we should get from this. And not only this, because in Judges, I think the Kenites might only be mentioned once in this context. But going forward and going back, not just in the context of the Exodus, but in the context of the overtaking of Canaan. In fact, I believe in chapter 1 or 2 of Judges, it says that the Kenites went with Judah into their territory. We know that from 1 Samuel, when David was in hiding from Saul all those years. And there was this long bit of time that he and the men who he had gathered to him were staying in essentially a suburb of Gath under the watchful eye of Achish, this king. And David would tell him that he would go out and he would conduct raids on parts of Judah, as in Judahites, Kenites, and one other kind of people that I don't remember off the top of my head. They're not mentioned very often. Maybe just in the context of 1 Samuel. Which made Achish happy, because Achish thought, well, David has completely turned his back on Israel because of Saul hunting him, when it wasn't the case. Actually, David was attacking Amalekites or Omlaki, and possibly Mitzri and other people who were more friendly with the Philistines than Israel or Judah. So David was walking a very, very tight rope, but he didn't touch the Kenites. In fact, when Saul went about, there was some business that had to be concluded with the Omlaki or Amalekites. because of them attacking Israel at a place called Rephidim, which was right before Sinai. When Saul went to do that, and he took what armies he had to do that, there were Kenites who were living near to a great city where the Omliki were. Now, before he attacked that city, Saul, he told the Kenites, because they had such good relations with Israel, to go, to clear out, because they were about to obliterate the Omliki. So we can see this continued good relationship with not only these Kenites, which all indications, all evidence we have tells us that the Kenites are not ethnically the same as Israel. Now, racially, were they the same or similar? Now, I personally think that that's probably the case. But I don't know that 100%. Okay? It's just going to have to be my opinion. I believe that would be the case, but I can't prove it. The same way that I can't prove what ethnicity Israel is. I can give you a lot of clues and evidence that I think are good, but I can't prove it. So we need to be very clear on that. These are things that I believe, but I can't really prove. So I believe the Kenites were ethnically different, and we know that ethnically different is a very real phenomenon. You can have people that are clearly close physically and mentally, etc., in a racial aspect, but quite different ethnically. You know, that's why people who still do work in ethnology, excuse me, and those kinds of sciences, I think I got something in my throat. Sorry. Those people recognize, for instance, the sharp differences in whites. You know, they'll consider those with more blonde hair or blonde reddish hair and bluer, greener, gray eyes and very light skin as a sharply different ethnicity than what they call alpinoid, which is probably much more what they would call me. A broader face, redder skin, hazel eyes, and like everybody in my family, I don't know anyone in my whole family with blue eyes. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember anyone, certainly not my immediate family. And other things. Eh, Darker hair, not really a lot of blondes or redheads. And then they might go to types of Mediterranean whites. So you can see that there can be a very sharp and distinct difference. Like, for instance, growing up where I grew up in Northwest Indiana, there was a community that was considered heavily German and Irish that I lived in. And then, not that far away, there was a community that was considered heavily Dutch. And it was very clear that there was a dissimilarity uh, ethnically. Now, living in Michigan, in West Central Michigan, where I do now, there are a lot of Dutch in West Michigan, and they strike me as actually different than the Dutch down there in ways. And they're certainly different in a lot of ways, ethnically, being physically or behaviorally, than people that I'm used to, my ethnic background. Okay, so you can have these people who are racially similar but ethnically distinct, and they know they are. This it could include language. The Kenites might have spoken a language that was different. It certainly seems that, for instance, the Philistines spoke a language that was different. The Mitzri spoke a language that was different, um, based on the language that we have in the Bible as it stands. But the Kenites lived among the Israelites in some capacity, not intermingling, but among them, and were friendly with them, the Kenites. Now, what makes this a sticking point for the people who spend most of their time charging their listeners and their followers with identity politics? Because anything that is Christian identity or British Israelism is loaded with identity politics. Now, I'm not going to say that identity doesn't matter. Identity does matter. And I think it's good for anyone, no matter who you are. Now, I say this just coming from my point of view. If I make a lot of arguments and I offer a lot of evidence that would point to the fact that I truly believe that I am descended from the tribes of Israel, okay, that might be the case. That might not be the case. If I were to find out in a very objective way that I was descended from a Mitzri, an Edomite, a Kenite, it certainly wouldn't change my perspective on the Bible and what I think that it's trying to tell us, the state of the world, peoples. I can't see it really changing those things. I think that people, no matter what they are or what tradition that they've grew up with as far as who am I, where do I come from, I think they have every reason to take pride in that and not wish they were something else. This identitarian point of view, I think, is remarkably damaging in a lot of ways. First off, because of the extremely inflammatory things that are typically said against other people who are not racially or ethnically the same as them. And what they turn it into, of course, is they make a bad situation worse by claiming that whites, not some, but all whites are Israelites. The Jews are evil and the seed of Satan, and then basically make unending negative comments about non-whites. And that's what it comes down to. Most of us know who have lived, really lived, and been around the block and have dealt with people of different ethnicities and races, that the picture that is typically painted by identitarians, and of course it's not just Christian identitarians, you also have the white nationalist identitarians et al. Those pictures that they tend to paint don't really play out in the real world. The things they say about various people, the good things they say about some people, and the bad things they say about others, don't tend to play out in reality. Now, it is a reality that when you force different ethnicities or races into one another's space, and then you further cause problems. Let's say you fabricate stories about a member of this race having these things done to them, terrible things, being bullied, beaten, raped, killed, which I believe a lot of those stories are invented. I don't think all of them are. I'm certainly not saying that. But we have criminal or violent elements in every different race and ethnicity. What I'm saying is if two different people were forced into close proximity and there really wasn't much of a problem between them, they were able to stay to themselves, and when they interacted with each other, they could interact with each other politely and civilly. What the establishment would do is they would cook up problems. They would create problems because they need those problems. The establishment does not stand if there are not problems. That is their source of power. Problems between races, peoples, absolutely problems between genders, problems they cook up, they make an atmosphere, an environment, so that problems can very readily happen. People can be demonized, criminalized in every way, shape, and form. That's what the establishment does to maintain their control. Do they target some more than others? I believe they do. I believe that they target those people who they see as the greatest immediate threat more than other people. And the problem with that is if the other people that they're using against, let's just say, for the sake of argument, agree with me or not, let's say the Celtic people. So if I say Celtic, what do I mean? I mean basically the poor people of various European countries and now America, and for a long time, that have certain similar ethnic marks. They might be called German. They might be called Belgian. They might be called Dutch or French because there were communities of Gaels in northern France. They might be called Irish, Scot-Irish. They might be called English because they were in a lot of countries. Still are. Still plenty of them there, and a high concentration of them in America too. So look, let's just say, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Let's just say these people are number one top of the list as far as people to deal with. Like deal with all the way. And they use other people, maybe other white ethnicities, maybe other races, other non-white people, to cause and create, disseminate, continue problems, strife. They use them to intermarry with them so they lose a sense of identity in themselves. This is all directed at a certain people, but they're using other people to do it because they don't use their own power and their own might. They use others. They use proxy armies. These people, not knowing, they never agreed to be their proxy army, but they agree to certain benefits that comes with the position they're put in, which is unfortunate. The sad part is after they, if their plans saw their complete fruition, after they're done with that, or after they're done with the people that they want to take care of all the way, once that's complete, they're simply going to take a look around. I'm sure they already have. They have it on a tier system. You can count on that. And they're going to see what people is next in line. Who's the people that we are going to have to take care of next, and how are we going to go about that? It's not like anybody is going to escape the watchful eye of those in power. They want to remain in power, and they will do whatever it takes for that to continue happening. So identity politics is very damaging, and it's very untrue. One of the reasons we can know it's untrue is because Jael, this woman, this wife of Heber, she and her husband were Kenites. Now, the only person, the only patriarch whatsoever that we can link to the Kenites in the entire Bible is from Genesis 4, Cain. Cain. Because his name in Obri, it's spelled Qyn, Queen, and the Kenites are Queenie. They are exactly, you take his name and you pluralize, you possessively pluralize his name, and you have the Keni or the Kenites. That's the only person or people we can link, and there's never, never a negative thing said about Israel being friendly with these Kenites. As we can see, they were not mingling with them. As we can also see, they were never told, you can't live near the Kenites, they can't live near you. Never. And there are other people that live near and around Israel that are people that they are never told, this is no good. The people they were told that they needed to expel in one degree or another were Canaanites, typically, abundantly Canaanites. They didn't do that. So then the Canaanites became a perpetual problem for Israel. It says that right in the first couple of chapters of Judges, that Yahweh left the Canaanite in the land to further test, tempt, try Israel, because they wouldn't do what he said in the first place. That's why he kept them there. But we have a people who the only patriarch in all the Bible that we could link them to is Cain or Cain, Genesis chapter 4. Now that's a huge problem, first off, for the Christian identity people who believe that Cain was some kind of product of sexual intercourse between essentially the devil and Eve, or whatever in Eve. And it always comes down to the devil and Eve. And of course, as far as they're concerned, Cain would be like the first Jew, right? As would the Kenites be. They would have to be. If they believe that Cain was this product of this sexual, and it's not just with Eve. I mean, they go as far as thinking that Adam and Eve and this Satan, which in Genesis 3, it's just called Nachash. It's Nachash. They believe that there was some kind of a threesome. A lot of them do. They had a threesome. Because, yeah, I mean, why not? Of course. That they had a threesome, and that Cain was the product of the seed of this Nachash, which they instantly change it to the English rendering, serpent, and that Abel was the seed of Adam. Well, the problem is then, if that's the case, and if those curses, first off, in Genesis 3, had to do with the seed of this Nachash, or serpent, that would come through Eve, which there's problems with that to begin with. If Yahweh is referring to the seed of Nachash and the seed of Eve, we've got a problem. Because if his seed is coming through her, then it would be his and her seed. You can't have his seed and her seed if she's bearing his seed. See the big problem there? So that's an issue. But just furthermore, if we want to believe that Cain was this product of this weird sex thing, and that everyone who essentially are descended from him, and I guess that they would mix in Genesis 6 with all that too, and probably a lot after that, if we want to go like the sort of Rob Skiba, Steve Quayle, whatever his name is, the prophecy guys, then it gets really convoluted, right? But we have to start somewhere, right? With Cain or Keen. We have these Kenim, Kenites. Well, if we have these Kenites, and they have no other connection that we can find in the Bible to anyone other than Cain, then we have a serious problem with the sort of identity politics that are pushed on us, which again, I believe that the sole reason for those identity politics are the same reason why the establishment would move different people types in, forcing them in next to each other, not, with a little bit of space, like I'm sure the Kenites and other people who lived among Israel, there was some space. They had their own communities and so on and so forth. They probably paid into excuse me, paid into taxes when necessary, and had um, business, like commercial business with Israel and other people. It was probably something like that. Well, that's not what the establishment does. They force people very much right on top of one another. People have a tendency to kind of stay in their own communities, their own ethnic communities and cultural communities. They don't, most people are not trying to invade one another's communities and are perfectly happy to stay to their own people, their own kind, and their own communities. The only thing that has made people sort of unhappy with that is the very rabid campaign that has been waged to make people somehow feel like they should be mixing with other people. I have to cough again. Anyways, so there is such a profound issue with the identity politics that are brought into either Bible study and Bible teaching, or like, white nationalism. And it doesn't have to be just white nationalism. You could be listening to me right now, and you could be among one of the various people types that are called Black, called Latino, called all sorts of various things which are not accurate and very good descriptions of who you probably are. And the thing is, you'll know that most of the people who act as your leaders, definitely ones that are in positions of influence in social media or religion or politics or whatever, they are going to continually keep your mind in that identity headspace. Now, again, it's not like you should feel bad if you have an identity that's an appropriate identity. Okay, white is not an appropriate identity. Black is not an appropriate identity. Brown, Latino, Oriental, it's not an appropriate identity. The problem is we've all been robbed of our appropriate identities. So I'm not saying I think there's anything wrong with someone having an appropriate identity, but I think most of us don't have that. We hear a lot of identity politics, either that charge us to try, they try to incite us to do bad things towards one another on the one hand, or they try to incite us into reproducing with one another, therefore losing the identity of both parties, what little identity we had. So there's a real sickness with the way, of course, identity is treated by the establishment in secret and by parties like Christian identity or white nationalism or Black identity, Latino identity, you name it. Again, not to be repetitive, but there's a serious problem with all of the expressions of identity, and we need to see that there really were, from the earliest days, with Israel, who happened to be the main subject here in the Old Testament, there were people who were different than Israel, either ethnically or racially, that were living with them for many, many years peacefully. I believe that all of this was first anticipated. And of course, there was no problem with the mixed multitude coming out of Mitzrayim with Israel. There was no problem when Abraham came into Canaan with him very quickly having these friendships and alliances with Canaanites at the time. He was friendly with Hatti or Hittites. He was friendly with Hui or Hivites and Amorites. He was friendly with them. So much so that some of them went with him to rescue his nephew Lot when those kings came and carried off so many of those people and their possessions from those cities. They went with him. It wasn't just him and his 380 something trained men, which is an amazing number for one man to have. I got to bring that up. But they went with him too. They helped him too. These were people who were different than him, at least based on what we have in Genesis 10, the genealogies from Noah. We know they were at least different than him ethnically. Different. He had alliances with them. Not a bad word was spoken about those alliances he had with them. Isaac made various alliances, sometimes with the Philistines, sometimes with the Mitzri, as well as Abraham. Now, the relationships they had with those people weren't always that great, but they weren't judged like there was something wrong with it. In fact, Jacob was going to give his daughter Dinah to this guy, Shechem. His father was Hamor, and they were the power, the authority of a certain area, because this Shechem was smitten with his daughter Dinah, and he wanted to take her as his wife. Unfortunately, Jacob's two sons, Simeon and Levi, didn't agree, and it would appear that Shechem had already had sex with her, and they took great offense to the aristocrat, because you got to remember, these people, they're simple people. Jacob and his sons, they're simple in the sense that they're herders. They are people of the land. Okay, they're not full of guile and politics. And you have to understand, even at that time, by then, the people who would be ruling all of the various areas of Canaan, where there would be large populations, as well as the Philistine areas, big areas, the Mitzri, so on and so forth, they would be people who were far more interested in political leanings, things that probably Jacob's sons would have found detestable, which many of you would as well, as would I. But still, Jacob was willing to do this without having the thought that maybe I'm doing something wrong. And he was never judged for having that mindset that he was going to give Dinah to this young, I guess maybe a prince or something, powerful young guy whose father seemed to have control of this place, because Jacob saw it as maybe it's a good idea, and there might have been a lot more to that than we think. He wasn't told at that point in time. By the way, it wasn't until a few centuries later that Israel was specifically told, don't intermingle with the Canaanites. And they were told, don't intermingle with these other people. This is all part of the dispensation of the law based on an agreement. Jacob wasn't told that. At that point in time, it appears it would have been a fine thing to do, or at least acceptable. And as we see later on in Genesis, when Jacob is dispensing blessings to his children, he knocks Levi and Simeon down in their ranks because of what they did regarding that matter of Hamor and Shechem and Dinah. Jacob's not judged for any of these things, his mindset and what he was going to do. Now, was it an intermingling? It was, and with Canaanites. And again, there was Nothing that I'm even remotely aware of that was an issue then. But you have to figure it was at least a few centuries later that the law, these agreements came into effect and these things were codified. And Israel was told, you don't mingle with these people, you don't mingle with these people. Now, a lot of that you have to consider was because, as part of a long term plan, Israel was going to be made into, they had been to a degree in Mitzrayim because obviously they were kept to themselves in their own communities during most of that time, if not all of that time in Mitzrayim. So they would have already by then been developed into a relatively well-defined people. And it was based on everything I've seen in the text, it was further Yahweh's plans going forward that Israel would remain a distinct people in the way they looked, in the way they acted, etc. From the time of Israel in the wilderness before they came into Canaan. So we have a big difference there. And from the time that they came into Canaan, they were friendly with these Kenites. And we keep seeing mention of the Kenites through 1st, maybe 2nd Samuel. I don't know if we see him in Kings or not, too. How about the fact that who was it that helped the Israelites spies when they were going to come into Canaan through Jericho? It was a Canaanite. Now, the people that specialize in identity politics will go out of their way trying to make some sort of a case like that Rahab wasn't really a Canaanite, but the text says that Rahab really was a Canaanite. And she was married by one of those two spies. She had children, and a few generations later, do you know what one of her descendants was? Within just a few generations, it was Boaz. Boaz was the man who married Ruth. Ruth was a Canaanite, or Ruth was a Moabite. She wasn't an Israelite who lived in Moab. Ruth was a Moabite. The language says it plain as day. And Ruth was the grandmother of David, a Canaanite and a Moabite, both in his genealogy. David took a wife from Aram. Now, by that point in time, Aram, even though they were, so when Abraham's father, Terah, moved him and his brother to the area near Canaan, his brother stayed back, and he ended up living in these territories of Aram while Abraham went into Canaan. So a lot of the marriages that were done were with his brother's family and other Aramite. That's true. But David, one of his wife was an Aramite. Also, regarding David, the one act that David committed that was held against him when everything was said and done at the end of his life, the one act held against him was the fact that he deviously, dirty, low down, took the wife of this man, Uriah the Hittite. He had sex with her when Uriah was still alive and off fighting against the Omni, or Ammonites, for David and for Israel. The lowest, low down, creepy shit. That's what David did. That's what David paid for, in the sense that the life of that first child they conceived was taken. Solomon was a later child conceived. But that mark was the one mark that was absolutely, without question, held against David. That he took the wife of Uriah the Hittite, which was bad enough. To take the wife of anyone is bad enough. He takes the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The Hittite. He was a Hittite. He was a Hittite that lived among Israel because, of course, all the Canaanites, the various tribes, Yahweh kept in the land to test and to try Israel. Apparently, this Uriah rose up in the ranks among Israel and was very loyal, to the point to where he was certainly someone important in the army, in Israel's army. And an Israelite, one of the greatest renowned Israelites, screwed him over and got him killed because he wanted his wife. Now, if identity politics were a thing, you might think he might not be judged so harshly. I mean, look, when these Moabite women, when Israel was still in the wilderness, were sent to get Israel off course. Now, the text as it stands says that they caused the men of Israel to go after other gods and all that. I'm not sure exactly how that looked in practice, but it certainly was a devious battle plan to use these women to get Israel doing some things they shouldn't have been doing. Now, when Israel took retribution on them, they did away with all the men in the areas where they went and attacked. They did away with all the kings and all of the women who had known a man. And they kept all the women who hadn't. You can think or feel however you want to about that. But what I'm telling you is there isn't the same standard applied, in the sense that there isn't some sort of lesser degree of moral wrong applied to David for what he did to a Hittite, which lived among Israel. Now, I don't even know if his wife was Israelite or not, because it doesn't say. It doesn't say. Now, did the aristocracy of Israel quickly become not entirely ethnically Israel? I don't know. It's possible. Because these kings and aristocrats, they took, wives from all over the place. That's true. The Bible records that. But not to get too caught up in those weeds. I think the main purpose here is, besides for all of the language, all of the terminology, in which we could very much be looking at different people types, racial types, ethnic types, being mentioned as being common to living among or near with Israel, and they're simply translated as all kinds of other things. We have in the text, as it's been translated and we can understand it, other at least ethnic types, if not racial types, living near to and having common, friendly interaction with Israel. I think if we don't recognize those things and them helping one another, they were good for one another. Again, they didn't intermingle, because I think that in general, most people do just prefer their own people, their own type. I think that's a natural thing. But then once the law was dispensed, there were certain laws that essentially just curtailed that. Maybe that's the wrong word. I'm sorry. Um, Hindered that sort of thing from happening in a common way. And so, what those laws would do is, if somebody married, had a child with somebody ethnically different than them, it would allow for them to essentially breed back into Israel. So even if you would have various people from different ethnicities, so on and so forth, that might intermarry with, have children with Israelites, based on the law as we understand it and it's currently translated, there would typically be that would, for one thing, typically be a minority incident, and that's how it was supposed to be kept. There wasn't supposed to be kept like this open-ended, you take our daughters, we'll take your daughters, that sort of thing. That was not okay. That was absolutely frowned upon. There were laws that were drafted that were meant to be like this. Look, say it should happen. I mean, excuse me, it did happen with Moses. So, say it should happen. Here are the laws. This is what should be done, so that Israel would still have an identity. I think so that those other people would still have an identity. Because I believe those people, they were all meant to have an identity that was unique, particular. But things happen. And I think far too much judgment and bile and vitriol has been used deliberately to keep people at odds, in enmity with one another, for the purposes of keeping the establishment strong and everyone else weak. That's the whole point. So if we keep playing that game and we keep using those terms and we keep thinking that way and we don't at least understand what's going on, I'm not saying we have to be happy about what's going on or how other people behave, because everybody's responsible for their behavior. We don't have to be happy about those things. But I think we need to understand that different people types can live among one another in productive ways without threatening the identity of one another through intermingling. And that this could be a very good thing, because since all people are different, different ethnicities are different, they act and think differently, they're built differently. Same thing with different races. But that doesn't mean that they're absolutely not complementary, which is a whole nother matter. And that's something that the establishment is very much keeping from our conscious minds, is how complementary we could be to one another as opposed to adversarial. So that was it for this one. I think that's plenty. Um, and hopefully it's plenty for you to think about, as it's been plenty for me to think about. So with that, hopefully I'll be able to talk to you guys again. Feel free to send me an email or a message if you want to know what's going on, how everything's doing, and all of that. And I will put the links again for my PayPal and Venmo and other ways that you could help support me at this point in time. It's very much needed and it's super appreciated. So I thank you so much for that. And I hope I will see you guys again soon.